Hello, and welcome to this European Environment Agency's Ask an Expert Facebook Live. I am Gülçin Karadeniz from the communications team at European Environment Agency, and today we'll talk about soils and land. And I'll be joined by two colleagues, Rainer Baritz. So, Andrus, please turn on your camera and your microphone. Rainer, are you there? Very good.
Hello.
So welcome. I can see you and hear you well.
Hello.
Very nice to see you. So as I mentioned, today we'll talk a little bit about soil, why it matters, why it's important. There are some recent developments in soils in terms of legislation and ambitions in Europe. And we have some knowledge about that. So before we actually start receiving questions from our live audience, which they can actually do in the comment sections in our Facebook feed, I will ask Rainer and Andrus to introduce themselves. Rainer, what do you work on? And can you just tell us a little bit about your expertise?
Yeah, hello, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Gülçin. I'm the soil expert in EEA. It sounds maybe a big word, but I'm actually by training a forester, and I have concentrated on soil protection and measuring the condition of soils in my career before I joined EEA. And at EEA, we are operating very closely to inform public and policymakers on the condition of soils in Europe and beyond. Also including our neighboring countries, and that is my work. I cooperate with experts in the countries in Europe. We collect information about the condition of soils, and we put it in information packages for our stakeholders, for the Commission, but also for the interested public, to give everybody an idea of how our soils are doing.
We'll talk more about what kind of knowledge we hold at the agency. But Andrus, what about you? What do you work on at the agency?
Thanks. Good morning. Well, I'm working with Rainer. In fact, I'm responsible for the team. It's called Geospatial Information Services. And it sounds pretty technical, but we are covering a number of aspects related to geospatial data, which includes land use as well as soil. And we are also involved in the land monitoring via Copernicus European Earth Observation Program.
Yeah, there are massive amounts of information there, and maybe we do receive some questions about that as well. So maybe we go back to you, Rainer. What is soil? Why should we care? What does it add to us? Can you just say in a few words?
We very recently we started to look at soils a bit differently than earlier technical definitions that soil is composed out of mineral and organic compounds, water, air, and living organisms, and that soils represent the top terrestrial layer of the earth. We begin to look at soil as a biomaterial, and biodiversity, soil bio microorganisms give a lot of function to soils in relation to securing the needs of ecosystems and also our health even.
So we are talking about a living kind of environment, living space, when you mean biomaterial.
Yes, it's comparable with our intestines, where organic material comes into the system. It's broken down into micro elements so that it can be taken up again for growth. That's the system.
Okay. And are there any indications as to the kind of benefits that it gives us? Like the economic benefits and the health of, like, why do we need healthy soils?
Well, economically, on a global level, there are some figures that, for example, the reverse and the halting of soil degradation could create roughly $1.2 trillion of economic benefits per year. That's a huge number. For Europe, we can say that soils help to enable some worth of roughly 50 billion euros of ecosystem services of croplands and grasslands per year. So the amounts of degradation when it affects crop security, for example, during hot summers, harvests, it causes other damages, follow-up damages like landslides and flooding. So when you add the role of soils into these disasters, then the costs are tremendous.
Yeah. I think that the role of soils is often undermined, but you did mention something. You talked about soil degradation, but maybe we'll look at the wider land degradation that, Andrus, you could maybe explain a little bit what it is, because we will be using these words in our chat.
Yes, I could add to Rainer that in my view, the key property of the soil is fertility. So it is providing the basis of food production for the entire humankind. And in this way, it is basically representing the basis of our life. And we can imagine how look the areas which do not have a soil, or at least soil which has a significant fertility. I mean, these are degraded or even deserted areas. And these are the processes that we are analyzing in order to see how close we are to this unwanted condition. And obviously, Europe is not a desert. We have a significant amount of soils that offer us this fertility and support for food production and ecosystem services, climate regulation. Nevertheless, there are some processes that we see driving us in direction of the degradation of land and soil. And
what happens when we say that land is degraded, or what is land degradation?
Yes, some of those processes are related to the loss of the land, literally. For example, processes like land take and soil sealing, where we are covering the fertile soil with some artificial surfaces. Of course, we need those surfaces for some other activities in economy, like roads or buildings. But at the same time, we are subtracting these areas from the natural circulation and food production that I mentioned before.
Mm.
And soil is a very valuable resource. I mean, it's not easy just you can grow trees and stuff, but soil, you cannot just grow it as such, right, Rainer?
Yes, exactly. That's why soil protection receives so much attention at the moment. We largely look at it as an irreversible, limited resource. And this is because the soil grows back, let's say, only roughly 3 millimeters in a century. So now when you think of compaction, drainage of organic soils, which also is a shrinking process, landslides, erosion, that cuts off the topsoil, which carries the organic matter, which is the soil which is closely related to soil fertility, and that hardly grows back. And what Andrus says, when it's sealed away, then it's basically lost forever.
So maybe just to follow up on that question, we talked a little bit about sealing, soil sealing, compaction, and so on. What can we say about the state of soils in Europe? I know that you have some idea and some statistics as to how healthy or unhealthy they are.
Yeah, we tend to follow a bit of a policy framework that we have to develop together with the Commission, with the European Commission, and with the countries in particular, that follows so-called soil threats. They are fairly easy to observe: the level of erosion, the level of compaction, the level of metals in soils, the level of surplus of nutrients beyond the level needed by our crops, the level of acidifiers in the soil that makes the soil very sour. So we have statistics at European level of how these so-called soil threats are doing. And maybe many of you are aware of our status and outlook of the environment reporting, which we do every other 5 years. And we had to signal soils as being not properly addressed when we look at the statistics of all these threats.
Mm-hmm. So ultimately, from what we know, we can say that they're not in very good condition at this point. There are many
Yes,
pressures.
at the moment we are estimating that roughly 60 to 70% of our soils are in an unhealthy condition.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you did mention some I understand as fertilizers and pesticides or other heavy metals and stuff entering the soil from some activities. Can you just maybe say a few things about, maybe Andrus, you could reflect a little bit about this kind of land use elements?
Yeah, mineral fertilizer is accompanied by elements, for example, cadmium in the soils. So we look at cadmium concentrations and how they are doing. We compare the concentrations with limit values for drinking water quality. And when we do this, we find out that 21% of our agricultural soils have cadmium values beyond the critical limits for drinking water. So this is very alarming. This is also explaining one of the reasons why the Green Deal Farm to Fork strategy that maybe some of you have heard of is pursuing the objective to reduce the use of mineral fertilizers.
Mm-hmm. Andrus, would you like to add to the kind of pressures?
Most of the soils in Europe are used for production purposes. And primarily this is, of course, agriculture, which is a key land use activity. Through that, the impacts on the soil are most pronounced. And this is where we are looking how to reduce the impacts, particularly if agricultural production gets very intensive. We're also thinking of so-called multifunctionality of the land uses, where we could combine the production function with other functions like regulation, providing the clean water, which is seeping through the soil, and many others.
You mentioned, I mean, agriculture and fertilizers, like cadmium is one of the, I think it's a heavy metal that is used in mineral fertilizers. So this is to kind of boost the productivity of the land, which of course, when you look at the bigger picture, we have the challenge of feeding Europe's population and beyond. So it's a question of how much and what and so on and so forth. But as you mentioned as well, there were a couple of legislations, including a recently proposed soil strategy. So it's quite new. Maybe you could, Rainer, mention a few things like the headlines of what the strategy foresees.
Yeah, thank you, Gülçin. I'm happy to share a new soil strategy, EU Soil Strategy 2030 has just been published by the Commission, which is an expression of a wish to go into dialogue with the member states to follow up on the improved protection of soils. And this is also what the European Parliament last April has also resolved in a resolution for soil protection. The headline is that by 2050, the Commission proposes that all soil ecosystems are in healthy condition. And this headline involves two key concepts. One, to look at soil as ecosystems or as fundamental elements of ecosystems, and the other is soil health. And here we are also stepping into a new paradigm almost, where the human ecological concept of health comes into play, which challenges us to inform about the condition of soils on a risk-based approach. So where do soils, when they degrade, really harm the environment, biodiversity, human health, animal health? Where are the effects? And then to say, okay, here we have critical limits, and that means we need to do something. And that relates then to other policies that are targeting ecosystem restoration, for example.
Yeah, we started receiving questions, but as a reminder to our live viewers who might have joined, if you share your questions, we will ask them to our experts, Rainer and Andrus. in our Facebook feeds comment section. The first question from Eleftheria is, how do we restore the health of our soils? Or is that even possible? Who would like to tackle that massive challenge? Maybe Andrus, we start with you first. You look at the land aspect, and Rainer, you could look closer at the soils, land use aspects.
Well, Rainer already mentioned the soil threats. This is the generic framework to assess the pressures that we, through our economic activities, are exerting on the soils. So reducing those pressures, and by that reducing the threats on soil, would be the easiest way to achieve more healthier soils. I would not start to mention them one by one because Rainer is much more knowledgeable about this.
Yeah, okay. Maybe for our audience sake, can I just, you talked a little bit about soil compaction. So just imagine that you build a road and you kind of squeeze it so there are no air pockets and so on. So that's what I understand from compaction or sealing and stuff, and it's kind of degraded, right? So if you remove the road, does the soil ever get back to its healthier state? So maybe Rainer, you could tackle it. For me, this is part of the restoration challenge.
Yeah, compaction is in fact a big challenge because especially in the subsoil where heavy machinery compacts, takes the air out basically and compacts the soil so that it's more difficult to penetrate by water, organisms and roots. No? And to reverse this is actually very difficult because you would need to plow deeply the soil up so that it can revive and or wait a long time until the soil naturally does it. So as Andrus said, the number one activity that you can do to restore as much as possible is through management, through adaptive management change. So regarding compaction, the kind of the aspects in discussion are trafficking systems, like intelligent trafficking on the soil so that it's not driven over in a simple language so many times at the same spot. There are guidances to access the field at a certain moisture condition. When the soils are too wet, then they are more likely to compact in a very difficult to reverse manner. So topsoil compaction is easier to tackle because with deeper rooting plants, give it some time with fallow and other techniques, you find some kind of perturbation, bioperturbation, which revitalizes the soil. The subsoil compaction is indeed very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, we can talk a little bit about the fact that soil is a very local resource. So what we mean by soil is not necessarily, the soil that you find in a forest in, let's say, Germany is not necessarily the same as the soil you find on, coastal areas in Greece in terms of moisture and the organic and the use as well. Can I just say that given this kind of local elements, is there any kind of knowledge that we have perhaps through Copernicus and stuff on the soil types and whether there are specific threats to soils given climate change, for example, because moisture is one of the components of soil? What do we know about local soils and the threats that they face?
Let me just start because you mentioned Copernicus, and indeed in the European Environment Agency, we are responsible for land monitoring service of Copernicus. This
for our viewers who don't know what Copernicus is, maybe you could also say what Copernicus.
Yes, Copernicus is European Earth Observation Program, which is initiated by European Commission in collaboration with European Space Agency. And there are several services, and one of the services is on land monitoring, and this is where our agency comes in. So we are providing the coverage of the land cover products. This is basically how satellites see the surface of Europe, and we divide it into a number of different products that are characterizing the land cover, which is biophysical complex on the Earth, but also land uses. We cannot directly measure the soil condition from these methods, but it is a very important and valuable proxy for soil assessments, also because it is spatially explicit. It means that we are able to monitor all those locations that you mentioned, Gülçin, at the same time by providing the entire coverage of Europe, but also individual spots. However, how to link it to the soil issues, this is where Rainer's expertise comes in, and we need to build it from there.
Yeah, thank you, Andrus. When we think of soil protection, we may operate with fairly large statistics and monitoring results, but we always have a local image of soil and land use in mind. So we are aware that soil conditions, whether you are on a sandy, silty, or clayey soil, whether one operates with soil under summer dry conditions in the south or now even in the north, whether the soil water household is replenished throughout the winter season or not. So we always have these so-called regionalized aspects in mind, because we know that not only does it make a big difference to our statistics, to the extent of soil threats, for example, this is also the level where practitioners come in. So if we do not speak a language that considers the enormous variability of soil and climatic or growing conditions, management conditions in Europe, then we would fail to actually be in touch and contact and cooperate with our most immediate stakeholders. So we try as much as we can with our available information sources to consider these local aspects, and when we apply critical values, for example, when we elaborate soil maps, then we always look at these regionalized components.
I did hint at the thing, but I have another question. We do have a comment from Habib, who is following us, who says that this is a very important subject. So good continuation. Thank you, Habib. A question about climate change and soil. So of course, the local conditions will change, but soil is a big carbon sink as well. What can you say in very few words? Can we mitigate climate change with soils or without soils?
Yeah, well, when we talk about the role of soils in our greenhouse gas system, then we, of course, know that the reduction of emissions is really key. However, we are managing soils for centuries, and that has degraded a key indicator in soils, which is organic matter. And organic matter helps soil to store water. So since we know that we have many soils deficient on organic matter, the replenishing of soils with organic matter has an ecological and also climate resilient function. And at the same time, there is a sequestration effect where you have a net sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere into the soil, which you can do for so and so much time. No? But the key aspect is really the very global indicator role that soil organic matter plays for climate mitigation as a side effect, but mostly for soil fertility and also ecological effects on the soil. And that includes the storage of water for seasons that are then water deficient.
So if I can also simplify, healthier soil is also good for climate.
Yes.
Yeah. Anything you'd like to add, Andrus, on the climate change?
Well, the soil is one of the most important carbon sinks in our system, and I think this tells already enough.
Yeah, and I think that with some of the way that we've been using soils, some of the carbon stored in soils has been released, unfortunately.
Well, to add to this, Gülçin, a hotspot in Europe for climate change effects and where soil come into the picture are organic soils. When we look at the current greenhouse gas inventories of our countries, then on the terrestrial side, CO2 emissions from drained peatlands that are agriculturally managed are skyrocket compared to emissions from other terrestrial compartments. So the focus on wetlands is, from a climate change perspective, a very important one, but also from an ecosystem health and ecosystem protection perspective, very important.
We've received a question from Marius, so it's more, I think, on the local side. He's asking about how can we ensure healthy soil at home in our gardens or community gardens? Is there anything that people can do?
People can do a lot. There is a beautiful, very beautiful soil care initiative from the Public Waste Authority in Flanders, as an example. There are other regional activities like the Dutch Circular Household Initiative, or also the Lower Saxony in Germany Action Plan on Soil. So surrounded regionally in action programs, you can learn what you can do. When we manage our kitchen gardens, our home gardens, we tend to be quite a heavy polluter because we apply fertilizers beyond the packaging recommendations. No? And when we see weeds, we use certain products. No? So the way we consume from our neighboring equipment markets, the materials recommended to us to protect the kind of the crops that we are kind of prioritizing in our gardens or kitchens or living rooms, that's where it starts. I mean, the soil protection, caring for soil starts in the living room pot where you have a plant sitting, but of course also avoid food waste. And we can part of a circular economy with our consumption decisions and also with the way we manage our private lives.
I could add that people are more and more keen on organic food, and organic food comes from organic farming, but organic farming assumes healthy soils. So this is how the link goes.
Yeah, I think it's also then linked to the whole food waste component. It's about the biodiversity restoration and other initiatives. I mean, in addition to the soil initiative, the Commission has got Zero Pollution Action Plan that does look at reducing some of the pollution issues at the source as well. Before we wrap up, can you just say a few words about the upcoming work? What could our viewers expect from the agency in coming weeks and months and years? Rainer, maybe we start with you on the soil work, and Andrus, we could take you next.
The European Commission with the soil strategy is attempting to follow up on the resolution of the European Parliament to be politically more active with soil protection. This is where we come into play as well. How to do that? How can we buy into the paradigm of health, of soil health, ecosystem health, with risk-based understanding of where soils are degraded, with recommendations what to do best where the soils are degraded. So we will come up with this concept, with indicators, and also with proposals for thresholds, where we will ask our partners in the countries to discuss with us of how to best address and tackle soil health so that a policy framework can evolve. This is our 2022 big perspective of work.
Very nice. And what about land use? We've got fascinating products and information coming up there as well.
Yes, our agency is committed to continue with the land monitoring, providing different products. But more and more, we see land monitoring by means of measuring land cover changes to be linking to the land use. And this is how we enrich the picture of our understanding about the land resources, but also a link to the land management. We also develop cooperation with our network, EIONet, where we have national focal points in each country. This is where we collect the information from the countries and on the so-called in situ dimension, so not measured by satellites. So based on the land monitoring and diversifying this towards land use, land management, and soil, this is how we link all those fields together. And now being encouraged by the new EU soil strategy, I think we will increase our activities in this direction.
That sounds very good. We have one last remark from one of our followers, Habib again, who thinks that actually it's good to increase the organic matter in the soil, and perhaps biochar, for example, could be a good solution for remediation, just as a remark. So with these words, I would like to thank my two guests, Andrus and Rainer. There's a lot more to discuss about this thing, but this was just to give a glimpse of the kind of issues at hand and developments, and also what we do in this fascinating domain. We'll be back with other live chats, but thank you, Andrus. Thank you, Rainer. Thank you, all our live viewers, for your comments and questions. And thank you to the team behind facilitating this. We'll be back.
Thank you.